podcast, which takes us deep into the topics that matter to professional interpreters. I'm your host, Maria Ceballos Wallis. Welcome. Today, we're going to find out why some interpreting encounters exhaust us more than others. Is it length, subject, setting, or a combination of these factors? Andrea Henry, a medical interpreter and researcher, is with us today to discuss her group's research on complicated encounters and interpreter fatigue. Welcome, Andrea.
Well, thank you, Maria. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Now, you have an extensive background in healthcare interpreting, including working as a full-time remote interpreter, as an in-person medical interpreter. You've also held several positions as an interpreter coordinator, interpreter training, and you've presented extensively on measuring interpreting mental fatigue. That's quite a resume, I'd say.
It's been a great career. I really love it. I've had an opportunity to like you mentioned, I've done a little bit of everything, but my biggest joy really is working at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta and carrying out this research.
Now, you began working as an interpreter in Oregon in 1994 and have since then, like I said, done all of these types of interpreting. Why did you want to try your hand at research? Were you bored?
No. The idea came to me when I was home and bored. So actually, that's a good point. I had had surgery, so I was home on medical leave in 2007. And like most interpreters, there's really not that much time while you're interpreting to look at your emails or do a whole lot other than just focus. But I was home and I was bored and I was looking at my emails, and I was one of the I was on the NCIHC listservs. I was a member of the NCIHC, the National Council of Interpreting in Healthcare. And I finally had time to read the emails, which was great. And this was way before Facebook, so there was really no opportunity to interact with anything else outside of that on my computer. And so I saw an email from Natalie Kelly, who had asked on behalf of a colleague what managers were doing, what coordinators, administrators were doing to measure their interpreters' workload. And that question really made me realize that I had an answer, but I had never thought of it. It was mostly that I'd had a couple seeds planted along the way in my manager role, where people would ask, leaders would ask, Andrea, what is the productivity of your team? Show us the numbers. And the numbers never really looked like what was actually happening. No one ever removed a position. No one ever said, okay, your interpreters are not productive enough. But that seed was planted, but it was planted and I forgot about it. And then that question was posed by Natalie Kelly, and all the answers that came in were the exact same kind of calculation I had done in management, which is to divide the minutes paid. So if you look at your 8-hour shift, remove your break time. In the state of Georgia, break time is unpaid. So you remove that, and then you divide that by the minutes you've actually been interpreting, and then you get an ultimate percentage. And that's what every single one of these people responded on the listserv. And I remember sitting there and thinking, but that's not really that's not the whole picture. A minute is not a minute. Some minutes are much more complex than others, and they require a lot more of the interpreter than others. And that's what got me started.
So did you go out and look for research or background that might be available to address that question? Did any of it exist?
I did. I started thinking about it because I responded to her, the email that she sent out, and I sent this wildly long response on all of these different factors that could impact an interpreter's decision making and concentration and the need to sublimate disruptions. And I sent that. And then prior to actually doing a little more looking for other models or looking for other metrics, I did present at a conference here in Atlanta, the CIRMIC, the Southeast Medical Interpreter Conference. And Orlin Marquez had approached me. He was my colleague at the time, but he had also been my boss twice. And then also one of my other colleagues had approached me and said, "Do you have anything to present on for this conference?" And I said, "I kind of do." I think I have an idea. I don't know how well it will be received, but I'll go ahead and I'll create a proposal. I did. It was accepted. I presented and I didn't really know what to expect. I just figured I'll keep my expectations low and I hope it'll mean something to someone. And the response was pretty enormous. There was a lot of interpreters coming up to me afterward and saying, "Oh my God, I never realized that this is why some encounters really do exhaust me." And then I had Otto Zellman come up to me, who I didn't know at the time. He's a German Spanish interpreter. And he said, "Andrea, have you ever heard of Robin Dean?" So he came up to me afterward and I said, "No." He said, "Have you ever heard of the demand control schema?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, what she argues," she's a sign language interpreter researcher and trainer, but what she argues in terms of training sign language interpreters is along the same lines of what you're saying here. Except, of course, I was wanting to create a measurement tool. And so he gave me the card, which I usually tell everybody I still have it. It's his card, and on the back it says DC schema Robin Dean. And so that was the beginning. So that was one precedent that I was able to research and look up, and I did start contacting Robin Dean to tell her, we're looking at this as a measurement tool, and what you've got is a bit of a precedent. And she's been extraordinarily resourceful and helpful. And then I started looking at the hospital. So I walk around and think, I know they're measuring things. They're measuring things all the time. They're looking at the complexity of the patient. They're measuring their vital signs to understand just how sick they are, which, for the purposes of thinking about complexity, I used to call it acuity, which is more of a clinical term for looking at the complexity of patients, how high acuity a patient might be. So in the emergency room, if somebody's got all of these vital signs that look pretty bad, like high heart rate, high blood pressure, bad color, all those things point towards a diagnosis, or they at least point towards the resources needed to take care of that person. And so in the emergency department, I walked up to Laura Jones, who's now our director of emergency services. At the time, she was the manager, I think, of the Eggleston campus emergency department. I said, "So what are you guys doing here? How do you measure? How do you look at how the sick the patients are and how many nurses you're going to need? How do you make sense of that relationship?" And she sent me a bunch of information on triaging systems, which a lot of people know, but they don't realize it's a basic metric. Whether or not something's code blue or something as simple as green. A patient that doesn't need much, and then there's a scale that goes all the way up to the blue. But she sent me other information. And then I started looking at other scales or metrics that we have at the hospital. And from that point, I thought, okay, there has got to be a way for us to translate this kind of measurement system so that if they know how many nurses they need based on these details, why can't we have something that gives us a way to calculate and measure an interpreter's work based on complexity, which of course is different for us. Our complexity is a little different than a nurse's, but it's the same idea. We have resources, like cerebral resources, that we need to employ in certain complex encounters. And so that's where it started. And then I approached Kathy Murphy, who is my main co-investigator on this research. She's a clinical nurse specialist in the cardiac unit. And she had been doing lots of research that I was aware of, and I interpreted for her regularly. So I approached her and asked for her help. And that's where we started.
Now, a project like this usually requires massive buy-in from an administration and from colleagues alike, especially something that has to do with data research and implementation. And obviously, your results are only going to be as good as your data gathering and statistical protocols. You had to put a team together, didn't you?
We did. We started with just Kathy and me. And then we had a statistician, Michael de Guzman. And then my coordinator at the time, Jose Sanchez, was also one of the team. So we had this team of people, all of us with our own bit of expertise. And we created the initial tool. And I will say that the tool over the last 10 years has gone through many iterations or many different versions as we've gotten smarter and realized certain aspects of the tool needed to be edited or cleaned up. But that was our initial team. But I'm a full-time interpreter, and I was at the time as well. So there's really not a whole lot of downtime for working on something like research. So most of my work was done on the downtime I created, on either on the weekends or on my lunch break, until we were able to get some funding. So the first bit of funding that we got was from a vendor. It was from Pacific Interpreters, and they offered to give us a grant without any strings attached, without having any input on the content or any benefit from it necessarily, except to benefit the field from an academic and research standpoint. And that money allowed us to have the wherewithal to have interpreters involved in this, but get coverage for them. So if Eva Martinez Fornos assisted, which she did, she did the initial translation of some scripts that we created for videos. That was one of our first attempts to see if the tool actually performed well. So to be able to pay her to do that, that's where that grant money was used to pay for interpreters to be involved in focus groups and for them to have the time to take an anonymous survey. So that's how the money was used. And then we also had different sets of interpreters to pairs doing what they call inter-rater reliability, which is a statistical term to look at the way a tool performs, and a tool is just a fancy word for something that measures something and gives you a result. So ours looks like a survey. And that money allowed us to have 2 interpreters use it with the same encounter, the same interpretation and assignment, and then use it independent of one another. And so then that money allowed us to let them do that while we paid to have other interpreters come and actually interpret for the family. So the money that we got allowed us to do a lot of this stuff because we could pull people from the floor, which is just an expression that we use in the hospital. Like if you're on the floor, that means you're interpreting. If you're in the office, obviously you're in downtime. So it allowed us to do that.
So this sounds like it was a development stage so that you could figure out what you needed to include in your tool. Now, once you determined what you needed to include in that tool, then what did it look like and how did you implement the first phase?
So we had a couple hiccups. We had our first statistician, Michael de Guzman. He left Children's. He moved to New York City. He transitioned to another job, and so we lost him. So we were kind of in a bit of a holding pattern until we could find a new statistician. And like most things, when you look back and connect the dots, it was the best thing to ever happen because we found Courtney McCracken, and she's a statistician who is part of the Emory Corps of Pediatric Statisticians, and also with Children's, and then now she's in another facility as well, another organization. And she helped in that final development phase. So all of the things that I just mentioned were part of the development, but what she did was she looked at like why we couldn't get over 70%. 70% agreement between 2 interpreters using the same tool or the same set of questions is not all that sexy. 70% sounds like what it is, like a C in your math class, and nobody wants a C. And so we were really striving for over 90%. And Courtney, being the expert that she is with statistics and with tools, was able to see where some of our problems were. And we redesigned some of the questions and just had them a little bit more concrete. Some of the same content, just a different way of asking a question so that people could easily answer it and have it yield the right result. So once we finished with that phase and we had 2 interpreters, Ana Maria Baracaldo and Eva Martinez Fornos, they did the inter-rater reliability, and they ended up with the newly designed tool with a 96% agreement, which is really good. That means that the tool, regardless of who uses it, with the same disruptions occurring during the encounter, will see the same thing 96% of the time. So after that, we were able to recruit 7 volunteer interpreters from Children's to use the tool, or essentially it's you can use it electronically or on paper. Most of the 7 interpreters used it electronically. One person used it on paper. And it's essentially something you can have on your cell phone or a tablet or a computer screen, where it's just like a survey. Like when Emory, if you go to Emory or Kaiser, any medical facility, they always send you surveys afterward, like a satisfaction survey, and how you would rate the care that you got, how you would rate the service. It looks like that. It's just a series of yes/no questions for interpreters to answer. So it's very concrete and objective for most of it. And then there is some degree of Likert scales, which is just the term to describe whether or not you agree strongly with something, or neutral, or not at all. It's that kind of a question. And so you answer it on your phone, and then you submit, and you're done. And so 7 interpreters did that for their encounters, all encounters, good and bad, the ones that they thought, oh my God, that was really exhausting, I can't wait to use the tool. And other ones that they were thinking, wow, that was textbook. Some encounters are just brilliant. Everybody behaves, everybody follows the rules, nobody interrupts each other, there's no construction noise, there's no double talk, there's no disruptions. And so we asked them just use it for everything. And we got 444 encounters from that phase, which was 3 months. And we analyzed the data, or the statistician did. She analyzed the data, and Kathy and I and Courtney, the statistician, got to look at it afterward. And the most amazing thing about it was that most of our hypotheses were confirmed. And then we had also some surprises. And so that part, again, it just sort of, it corroborated or confirmed that the tool performs quite well. It works really well. And then it also had the potential to give us information that we wouldn't have necessarily known was gonna come out of it.
So let's start by sharing with the audience what kind of information or what kind of questions were asked, or which factors you were looking for.
So the tool, and it does have an actual name. It's the CPHI tool. So CFIE, which stands for complexity and fatigue in interpreted encounters, the CPHI tool. So in addition to the 7, I should mention that another 17 also used the tool through May of last year, and we just received the analysis for that. So a total of, 17 and 7, 23, 24 interpreters have used it at Children's, and we're in another phase right now with outside hospitals. But what the tool measures are the disruptions that an interpreter has to attend to while they are concentrating on the message. So if you think about interpreting, it's fairly complicated from a cerebral standpoint. You've got input, processing, and then output. And all of that involves 2 different languages, 2 different sets of cultural components that do inform upon the interpreter's decision-making. And so the tool is really measuring whether or not certain disruptions happened, and disruptions are what makes it complex. Things that you have to actually pay attention to, whether or not you made a decision to, for example, if 2 people are talking at the same time, or you have someone interrupt your process, whether or not it's your receptive process or your expressive process. If somebody interrupts your process, you have many decisions you could make. You could ask them, give me just a moment, this is the interpreter speaking, can you say that again? Yeah, just missed what you said because she was talking at the same time. Some interpreters would choose in that moment to try to ignore that second speaker and continue focusing on the first speaker and roll with it. There are a multitude of ways you can handle it, and the tool does not measure that. The tool is just measuring whether or not you had to attend to a disruption. And the disruptions on the tool are in 3 sections. So the first section is looking at communicative disruptions. The second section is looking at sensory. And the third is intrapersonal and physical. And so and then of course there are elements as well on there, like the start time, end time, looking at duration, looking at the department that somebody was in, if there's any kind of pattern around certain departments or certain facilities. And so what we did is when we got the analysis back from the statistician, we could see that one facility had higher fatigue scores, and they were the same. The fascinating thing was it was the same set of interpreters that were going back and forth between the facilities for the most part. There were several PRNs that were in that group. And so one facility had higher fatigue, and certain departments also had higher fatigue, like the fast-moving departments and the unpredictable departments.
So it sounds like some of the situations that interpreters consider to be part of their regular work. In other words, having to deal with people talking at the same time, having to ignore the construction outside, also having people maybe not even, ignore the interpreters, the interpreters in the room, or maybe even attempt to speak the language the interpreter is speaking. Mm-hmm. That these things that we normally encounter and we consider to be normal for us can actually be quantified and can actually be taken and measured so that we understand what the effect on our cognitive load is.
Yes, and that's the entire premise of it, is that, if you look at the absolute basic definition of interpreting, or just a really simple, superficial way of thinking about what we're doing, that in and of itself, just hearing information, processing it, and then transmitting it into another language requires an incredible amount of concentration and an incredible amount of cerebral energy, if you think about it like a gas tank. And then, in addition to that already very, very complicated job, you have disruptions coming at you. And those disruptions are things that an interpreter has to attend to, in addition to the already quite full plate that she already has in trying to take this information about a bone marrow transplant or a new monoclonal antibody treatment or complications around a thyroid issue and metastasizing cancer. That in and of itself is a very complicated process for the interpreter. But when you're having to attend to all these disruptions to your concentration and also the additional decisions you're making, do I stop everything? Do I not? Do I interrupt for this purpose? Do I not? That in and of itself is another form of cognitive load. It's a decision fatigue. And then there's the sheer fact that we have to concentrate for long periods of time, just really excessive concentration. All of these things in the literature are proven to cause mental fatigue. We've just never quantified it for an interpreter. And there are, and this, I think this is one of the seeds that had been planted prior to Natalie Kelly posing that question. I had a couple instances where I just, over the years, had walked out of an interpretation and I thought, God, that was weird. Like, I'm so exhausted and it was only 20 minutes. And another one, and that was with one particular nurse, I won't name names, lovely person, but very, very, very complicated assignment. And then I had another one that was hours. They had no one that could come and cover me. So I was there for hours. And it was a very complicated conversation about bone marrow transplant and an embryo being used essentially to make sure that they would be a match for a transplant later on in this child's life with a new baby. It was a very complicated conversation, and it was hours, and I wasn't fatigued. And I remember walking out of that and thinking, that's really weird. Like, why am I not? Like, if it is true that the longer it is, you should be that much more fatigued. How is it that I'm not? And so those little seeds were planted. And so once we got to this stage with the research, I think the desire really is to quantify it and to be able to calculate what kind of workload really is occurring for interpreters. And most of the time, if you think about it, this tool could be used as a retrospective kind of analysis, right? You look at the last quarter As a manager, you look at the last quarter and try to understand, okay, I had 62% productivity, just looking on the surface at the basic calculation of hours paid divided by hours worked. But if you add the complexity factor, which the tool would allow a manager to take a look at that based on the interpreter's tracking with the tool of their assignments, some of which, like I said, are perfect, and some have elements of complexity, and some can really knock you over the head. With adding that, that gives them a way to look at workload and productivity in the same way that other service lines do. The ICU staffs nurses very different, or the intensive care unit is staffed. It has more nurses than a clinic environment. There's one nurse to each patient generally, and maybe 2 patients per nurse. In a clinic environment, which is very low complexity or low acuity, you might have multiple patients for one nurse, because the complexity and the workload is lower in terms of what is required of that nurse and the resources that the patient needs. So it gives
Now,
us an
earlier
opportunity.
that I wanted to follow up with that. Earlier, you mentioned that the first results confirmed your hypothesis. What was the hypothesis you were looking to confirm?
Well, so we are in an external validation phase right now. And since your podcast is quite well known and people listen to it, I can't give too much information because I don't want to bias the interpreters in Boston, Nashville, and Seattle. That we have a group in Boston that's going to get started on training very soon. In Nashville and Seattle, we're still waiting for people to sign up. So I can't give too much information because it's very likely someone could listen to this podcast and be biased. But we have shared in previous presentations that we saw, we assumed certain departments would actually have higher fatigue, and that's what we saw. And we also, we hypothesized, and we also hypothesized that the certain aspects of duration would be related to fatigue, and I'll leave it at that. And that was the case. One surprise, and I can share this, one surprise was that, in our training, we're taught to do pre-sessions, to sort of, in my way of thinking, it is to kind of prepare everybody for what I'm going to do. And to also kind of set the stage and establish some, some rules. And that was a question on the tool just for, out of curiosity, did you do a pre-session or not? And of course, the data is anonymous. The statistician is analyzing it, so I have no access to it. Our entire management team, which includes a variety of layers. We have Alison Arevalo Amador as our manager across the entire system. We have a supervisor, Shirley Ocasio-Reeves. And we have multiple team leads, Amy Camelli, Paula Gomez, and Susan. And so no one has access to that data. So we tried to tell the interpreters and assure them, nobody's going to see whether or not you did a pre-session. So nobody's going to judge you. We just want to know if you did. And we want to see if that might play a part in people potentially following the rules. Because one of the hypotheses was that when people do not take turns and do not stay in one language and do not speak at a normal tone, the low talkers out there that mumble and we can barely understand them, we hypothesized that those would probably be associated with a higher need for concentration by the interpreter, a higher level of decision making, which would ultimately contribute to fatigue. And so we wanted to know if a pre-session might make a difference. And the odd thing that we saw in the data was that the interpreters that did say they did a pre-session also had more fatigue. So it was the weirdest bit of data in the sense that, the assumption would be if you set the tone and you establish the rules, people would follow them. And that is not necessarily the case, but there's so much more to that data that we don't know. And of course, one interpreter on the team had said, it's possible that, and this is consistent with my practice as well, sometimes I really establish the rules when I think nobody's going to follow them. So the assignment could have inherently already been complicated, like a family conference. So when you walk into a family conference, there's a large group of providers, a huge board table, and you're sitting there with about 12 people. And that could be what that data means, that people generally do their pre-sessions in situations that are inherently complex. And so we shouldn't be surprised that they were fatigued, but it's hard to know. But that was a surprise.
Well,
That needs to be teased out.
it sounds to me also like not all pre-sessions are created equal.
Yes. Well, we did define it for the purposes of the research to keep it as consistent as possible. We asked them to look at a list. It was maybe 5 factors. I don't have it in front of me. And if they hit 3 of those, 3 out of the 5, then they can consider it a pre-session, because we did recognize we all are sort of unique and we customize them. So that's a very good point.
Would it be fair to say that your hypothesis or your hypotheses were looking to validate the kind of personal experiences that interpreters have, where they leave the setting and they go, oh my God, yes, that was exhausting. And or maybe that part of that encounter was just very, very difficult. And they may not correlate it directly with fatigue, but they know that that part of the encounter was problematic. So it's all anecdotal evidence that we have that we share with our colleagues all the time. But here now we're actually trying to see whether, in fact, these perceptions that we have are actually producing these potentially negative results.
Yes, that's a very, very articulate way of putting it. I think what we would really like to, and then this really does segue perfectly into what we'd like the tool to be for interpreters. So there's a lot of talk about what it could mean for an administrator, which ultimately affects us tremendously. But in thinking about it for interpreters, for interpreters who have those stories but don't really know, necessarily what they really mean to them and their mental gas tank, but they share them because they need to get it off their chest. And you walk out of an encounter and you think, oh my God, that nurse didn't finish one sentence. It was like a half sentence the entire 30 minutes, and it's very hard to work with as an interpreter. That is not normal speech, but yet it's reality, and it's important for us to manage it the best we can. But the goal, I think, for interpreters is to have this tool give them something that really does validate their experience enough to be able to have it be more logical and not be just an anecdote, but to say, well, no, of course it figures, or no surprise there that this encounter really did require me to take a break afterward. Like, to be able to move on, I think is the biggest question for most of us. Am I going to do a good job on this next assignment if I don't give myself some breathing room? And I think, that validation, I think, can increase interpreter satisfaction. It can increase our engagement in our work, and that we can predict, like, oh, I'm going to be working with that, that lawyer. I don't work in legal, and I really admire legal interpreters. But like, if you're going to work with someone that you've worked before, you can predict what it's going to require of you. So it can increase your knowledge about your needs when you're interpreting enough to be prepared for it. It can increase your satisfaction because you understand this particular nurse or this particular parent. For me, I work with parents mostly because I'm at a children's facility, that they might require a little more of me. And so it'll give me a little more opportunity to be better able to predict what it's going to require. I can't prevent the fact that the intense concentration, the exceptional decision-making in certain encounters is going to cause fatigue. It's just going to. But the goal with interpreters would be to increase that awareness and therefore increase satisfaction, and hopefully keep more of us in the field as interpreters in the trenches. And then, of course, the other very big part of that is having administration have an actual metric to prove that their interpreters are more productive than the minute for minute analysis seems to indicate, that they actually do have a much higher productivity, which would make it easier for providers who need more interpreters to argue, you guys need to hire more. And then the administrator has the metric to prove, our interpreters are working at an exceptional productivity rate. This is not acceptable. It's too high. They're going to make performance errors. We don't want that. This is healthcare. And so there is that piece that validates a manager or an administrator's need to approve another position, which of course just makes interpreters that much more satisfied if we have more people to share the workload.
Now, you mentioned that you're not a legal interpreter. However, in legal interpreting, we always strive as a best practice to have what is known as team interpreting. This is based on a few research papers, but really there hasn't been, I don't think, a lot of very quantitative data that goes as far as showing these results the way that your research is attempting to do so. Now, do you envision that this data could be used in the medical interpreting field to actually um, send in replacements? That you would anticipate that a particular type of situation and that an interpreter has been there for 3 hours or for 2 hours and it is a complicated matter, it's a high stress matter as well. Would a manager then say, based on this information that we already have, we're going to send somebody to replace you in an hour, in 2 hours, or you're going to work together as a team so that you can both have enough recovery time to, do this marathon as opposed to the sprint?
Yeah, I think it would be highly effective to be used as a predictive type of tool, in the sense that you could say, based on past information from these types of assignments or with these parties who do have these communicative patterns, or this environment that has particular sensory issues that could be playing a part in the interpreter's performance, or the intrapersonal section, which I didn't mention much of, but there is a component of it that is related to vicarious trauma. So, if you're in a particular encounter, say in healthcare, that does involve all kinds of intense vicarious trauma, maybe it's a rape, or maybe it's an impending death, or maybe it's just really bad news, but not necessarily death, but we don't really know where this is going. And when you have that kind of information already, that does help management or our dispatchers in healthcare to predict just how long it would be reasonable for an interpreter to continue going. And most interpreters do not stop interpreting before they start making mistakes. There was research done, and I'm sure you know this. And speaking of team interpreting in legal, I did use one of your well-known papers in my original write-up to corroborate this need. So team interpreting, I think, is very effective, though we don't have enough research on it yet. But there was research done on conference interpreters years ago that showed that interpreters, after a certain amount of time, started making mistakes, but they didn't realize they were making mistakes until 30 minutes after they had already been making them. And that's the problem. We're so focused and we're so online, a term that Rachel Herring, a researcher and trainer in our field, uses. You're so online, there's just no ability to police yourself because you're so in the zone. And so you don't often realize how many errors you're making. You might be aware of a couple, but I suspect, like that research showed, there's a lot we're not aware of. And so if you can predict that at a certain point, like you mentioned, an hour, you get a replacement, that would bode well for everybody. Again, it's healthcare. And just like in legal, people's lives are at stake. Their freedom is at stake in legal. And you don't want to have an interpreter who is potentially making mistakes that could negatively impact the outcome. And so there's a good argument for it. We just don't have the proof yet. And I would be very, very happy if this tool could be used as well in that regard.
Now, all of the interpreters who have used the tool so far are full-time interpreters, is that right?
No, there's a variety at Children's. So at Children's, we've had 24 use the tool, and probably the majority of them are full-time. And at Children's, full-time is 32 hours. So anything over 32 is considered full-time. But we had part-timers use it, and per diems or PRNs So those are people that might do 2 shifts a week. They sign up for the shifts that that they want at the location that they want. And so we had a variety of people that represent different types of hours per week use it, but they were all Spanish. So that is the aspect of our data that is wonderful, but it's also a limitation. We don't have other language pairs to show us how the tool works for them. Boston is going to give us that opportunity. They have a very diverse team at Cambridge Health Alliance, and there's Portuguese, Spanish, and Haitian Creole, and maybe Mandarin that have signed up. I'd have to look at the list. And so that'll give us an opportunity to see how the tool works. It's in English, of course, but different languages might experience different types of disruptions, or they might experience the tool in a different way. And so our question really is, will it perform for them as well? And so that data that we get in the next several months will give us a sense of how well it works with other language pairs.
Now, with your extensive background in telephone interpreting and remote interpreting, do you see this tool being used by agencies, companies that have full-time remote interpreters?
Yes. When I've presented over the years, people have asked me, can this tool be used for VRI or OPI? And initially, we had only tested the tool for face-to-face. So my thought was, like in any other tool development situation, to use it in another modality, you have to adapt the tool. And with the circumstances of last year with COVID and everybody going remote in some of these hospitals, at Children's, we stayed face-to-face. And I was aware that, especially in some of the hot spots across the country, all the interpreters were going completely remote. And Cambridge Health Alliance is one of them. They all went home, and the IT people came there and set them up, and they did VRI and OPI from home for months. I think it's only been in the last few months that several have gone back on site, and some are still working either at home or they have a center. So they have their own center of full-time interpreters and probably part-time and per diems that are part of that remote service. So the tool now is going to be tested, and Boston will be one of the places that tests it, as well as Nashville. All of the Nashville team at Vanderbilt are all still remote. So they're all doing OPI, I think mostly, and maybe some VRI. So the tool will be tested for them as well. And so we'll get a chance to, so it has to be adapted, and you have to add like a little menu. And my team lead and colleague, Amy Camelli, is a bit of a red cap whiz. She's just fabulous, but she's going to just add a little menu that allows them to say this was OPI, VRI, or face-to-face, so that the data can be separated out and we could see how it performs with those different modalities.
Now, what about an adaptation for legal interpreting or other types of, well, I guess legal interpreting would probably be the next category, which could benefit from this?
I've had people reach out and ask about it. I think it very much could be adapted to a legal setting, and the key would really be to get a round table of legal interpreter experts to not only look at the content of the tool, but to also have an opportunity to do just like what we did in the initial part of our development, to get anonymous survey feedback, and then also to do focus groups, so that we get a really good sense of the things that are consistent with our content in healthcare interpreting, which I imagine many of them will be very much the same across those two different arenas, medical and legal. And then I imagine there's probably going to be some that are not on there currently that need to be on there. So it would be an adapted tool for legal. But I would absolutely think it could be something that could be effective. It would just need to be adapted and have all that expert knowledge infused into it.
Now, when do you expect the next group of results to be available?
So I just got news from Vanessa Costa. She's the director at Cambridge Health Alliance, that her group of interpreters, the ones that have signed up, are ready for training. So now we're planning to do the training. It's just has to be consistent with the entire methodology that we used previously, which is one-on-one training. And we did get I didn't mention this, but we got a $20,000 grant from the Dudley Moore Foundation back in late 2019. And we were supposed to complete this by the end of 2020. But COVID happened and the pandemic put a hold on a few things. And the silver lining is that now with the money that we received to complete this, and I'm still interpreting full time, by the way, but the money does allow for me to actually have some dedicated time to work on this, and I'll be able to train all these interpreters virtually. So I'll be able to do like you and I are doing right now in Atlanta, but in different locations. I will be here, but at the hospital doing the training for the Boston interpreters. And so once they're all trained, then they will get to use the tool for about 3 months, just one shift a week, and then we'll move on to the next 2 facilities. So it's very likely we would have data by the end of the year. And then we would be done. So that every time I thought we were done, then I realized, okay, I don't know enough about statistics and research and all these things. And I've thought we were done several times, but my understanding at this point is that once it is validated or used at outside facilities with a more generalizable group of interpreters, and if our data is consistent with what it has been previously, then it would be released. So the tool is meant to be free. We don't have an intention of selling it, but it is copyrighted. So it's already copyrighted Emory University and Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. We copyrighted it in 2018. And the tool would be released to managers and administrators, coordinators, directors across the country with just a simple license agreement. So maybe 2021, no, 2022. Yeah, 2022.
It's amazing to think that we're already in 2021. 2020 just went by like a flash, didn't it?
It did. Well, it went by real slow first, and then it went by fast.
Andrea, while we wait for these results, what advice do you have for interpreters who have encountered situations where they feel are contributing to their mental fatigue, but are not sure whether it's, in their mind, or maybe they didn't sleep well the night before. They're not sure whether to attribute it to the encounter or to outside factors. What would you say to them?
What I would say, and I've been asked this, I feel like when I presented to CHIA in 2019, this question came up, like, what do we do in the meantime? And what are we going to do with this? Like, how do we handle some of these encounters that cause us fatigue and then potentially affect our performance? And my first recommendation would be to be aware. That is the first thing. And if you are aware that encounter did remove some of the gas tank, your cerebral energy, then if you're at a hospital, so I work at a hospital, I have like I mentioned, a really well fleshed out leadership team and dispatchers. If you're in a hospital, you're quite privileged, and you have the advantage of directly telling maybe the dispatcher or whoever is sending you to new assignments, is to let them know, state what you experienced and say, listen, that one took quite a bit out of me. And even if you don't have the verbiage or the words to say exactly why, say, I just need a moment before I move on. And sometimes I do that. And like I said, we do have a bit of an advantage at Children's and a very supportive management team. And so I can say that and have them understand. That doesn't always mean I get much of a break, because sometimes there are patients waiting. There are kids that are really sick. Sometimes people are in trauma. Sometimes there's just no way to do it. But the goal is still to voice it. So I would say your first strategy is to just say, listen, that was really tough. Is there a possibility I could go hydrate and void? Because, in healthcare, they talk about voiding all the time, which is the weirdest thing, but that's, going pee. So you can just say, listen, I need to hydrate, I need to go to the bathroom. Is that possible? If it's not, fine. But if it is, then they've already started to understand, at least because you've stated what you need, that they might actually understand that you need it. And you may not necessarily have the data yet. You don't have the tool yet. There's no way necessarily to corroborate it, but just saying it is the first strategy. And I think the other thing is to expose your management to it. So if you work with an agency, And we have a bunch of agencies here in town, several of which are really well known and respected. You can also let that person know, either the owner, if that's who you directly work with, or if they have somebody who's managing the assignments, almost like a dispatcher, let them know as well. Even though with agency work, you may not be going back to back, you may be driving, you might have some time to clear your mind when you're driving, just to kind of like, stop all the input and the disruptions. Though some people would argue that driving is quite stressful. So I don't know if that would be an opportunity to relax, but to at least let them know so that they can predict it for the next time. So sometimes this information, when you voice it, may not change the reality of today, but it will give them an opportunity to predict the next time. So if another interpreter, that same interpreter goes back to that same provider, or if it's legal, that same attorney for that same kind of deposition or whatever it is, it does give them information to know, okay, this may be an encounter that might be worthy in the future, I don't know now, of team interpreting. Something that gives them information. We have to articulate what our experiences are, because otherwise people they can't know, they can't read our minds. So my first strategy and main strategy would be just to talk about it. And at the hospital, even though Allison does not have the data yet, we're not using the tool as a team yet, I would say that because we talk a lot about it, it does start to permeate the way we think about how we manage workload. And it does also in a team environment, which of course is another unique thing. But if you do have a team environment, just let your colleagues know, wow, that provider interrupts constantly, or that provider just talks over at the same, or that mom speaks Spanglish and it's going to be really tough. She'll say things like, pues, luce great. And you're thinking, well, I don't know what. Did you ask her? She's like, yeah, pues luce muy bien. And so, you have to prepare people for these elements of the assignment that are going to be more complicated and that may or may not cause fatigue. But I think we need to just really articulate it. And I think that will go a long way to people really understanding just how hard this job is and maybe valuing us just a bit more.
Now, part of the medical interpreters code of ethics, as well as all interpreters code of ethics, is to acknowledge and recognize when there is an impediment to performance. It would seem to me that interpreters just need to, like you said, be aware and make sure that they advocate for themselves if they feel that at any point they can't perform as they are expected to do. Of course, you're in a medical situation, and the first rule, the golden rule there, is do no harm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you've got to speak up. So if we're going to articulate that something was quite complex and that our gas tank might be pretty empty, that's one part. But the other part too is knowing when to say, "Pull me out of the game." Like the Joint Commission, the whole Speak Up campaign. It's not about just speaking up as a nurse or speaking up as a physician and noticing something's wrong here, that the patient's status is at stake, but it's also it's the patient's ability to speak up, and the interpreters, we have to speak up as well. So we speak up on behalf of the patient, and we speak up on behalf of our ability to perform well enough to make sure that the patient isn't negatively impacted by our potential for mistakes. So that could be part of the way we articulate it. It's a really good point, Maria, because you can say, listen, I recognize things may be very busy, but I'm really worried I'm going to make some mistakes if I don't get a moment. Just give me a moment. And then it is up to us. I have some techniques myself, but it is up to us to figure out a way to refill that gas tank as quickly as possible. And I think that's another phase in the future, to figure out what is it that we do besides time that allows for an interpreter whose job is so highly complex and requires so much concentration. What is it that we need to fill our mental gas tank besides time?
Andrea, thank you so much for sharing your research with us. We look forward to having you back here to discuss the next round of results as they become available.
Thank you so much, Maria. And thank you to De La MORA Institute. I really appreciate this opportunity.
To our viewers and listeners, we hope that this podcast has enriched your journey along this fascinating field of interpretation. Thank you for joining us here on Subject to Interpretation. Take care.